Good morning, friends. As Gavin has just outlined, yesterday morning, Leslie Richards and Adwa Bittle introduced to us the thinking of the Revision Preparation Group and the recommendation accepted by Meeting for Sufferings and forwarded to us here at yearly meeting for a full revision of Quaker faith and practice, beginning with church government. Leslie's introduction also noted that much of the church government text of our current book draws heavily on the 1967 revision, although the 1994 revision did restructure that text and incorporate new materials. And we have also made many incremental changes to Quaker faith and practice over the years since then. So chapter 15 on trusteeship, for example, has been completely rewritten since 1994, following changes to charity law and our own developing approach to stewardship. But as Leslie reminded us, and Gavin has just said, you can only keep patching for so long before you need to strip back and renew. So in sessions yesterday, we have had an opportunity to reflect on the idea of revision, and again this morning, to listen to each other and the different thoughts and feelings we have about such a change, to explore our religious diversity and think about making space for missing voices. And this morning in the all-age worship, we have seen something of how our life and community can be told with few words. So our task now is to consider what a possible revision might mean in terms of the presentation of our church government, which, as you heard yesterday, is one reason for proposing a revision now. And this afternoon, we will be ready to return to the central question on whether to accept the recommendations for a revision. Now, I don't think very much of what I'm going to say in the rest of this introduction is new. You can think of it as the Appendix D live remix, if you like. The phrase church government is used by Quakers and some other churches. It's jargon, or if you like, a useful shorthand. So what do we mean by it? You'll find it described in documents in advance as the sections of Quaker faith and practice which focus on our procedures and corporate discipline. In simple terms, it covers things like our structures, our local, area and yearly meeting, how we should look after finance and property, how we organise a marriage or a funeral, what roles we normally appoint to in our meeting, and how we make decisions. There is information about all these issues and many more in Quaker faith and practice, and very useful it can be too, especially when we read it. But before I go on to talk about how church government material might be differently presented after a revision, I want to note two important truths about our church government. Firstly, how we organise ourselves is a spiritual as well as a practical matter. Our practice not to have separate clergy, for example, reflects our belief that all have equal access to the divine. Our organisation into meetings reflects our understandings of religion as a collective rather than a purely individualistic endeavour. Indeed, our decision-making processes at their best give space for inspiration as well as administration. And indeed, as Quakers, ideally the sacred and the secular are interwoven into one piece. That's chapter 2, extract 88. So while, of course, we all have our own skills, interests and service to give, we cannot hive off church government as a separate matter simply for our local or national staff, or just to our clerks, treasurers or trustees. And equally, if we feel weighed down by or alienated from our collective decision-making structures, our spiritual life is likely to suffer. The second point is that while aspects of our practice are distinctive, our church government is constantly interacting with the wider world. Save when compelled by deep and tested concern, we respect the laws of the state, and that law is constantly evolving. And it's not just the law that changes. Institutions that Quakers interact with, prisons, schools, local government, district registrars, the Charity Commission, will change the way they do things or the terminology that they use. How we run our meetings is also influenced by technology, opening up all sorts of new options for creating and sharing information, for example. Our current book and its many editions keep up with some of these changes better than others. The word internet does not appear in Quaker Faith and Practice, for example. And email just 3 times, all in the chapter on membership. So the first of these points, the sacred and the secular, is one reason that the revision that led to the 1994 Quaker Faith and Practice brought together all of the material into one volume, our faith and practice intertwined. But the second point has been one of the biggest difficulties for the single volume model. In order to try and keep current with both internal and external changes, we are now, as Leslie illustrated, on our 5th edition plus supplement, and even that's not truly the current version, as further changes are agreed by yearly meeting. The online version of Quaker Faith and Practice is easier in practical terms to update, but it's still dependent on the approval of all text by the yearly meeting. That's necessarily and rightly a slow and careful process, yet such is the rate of change in the world, text on details can go out of date even in the months from initial drafting to yearly meeting approval. Over the past 3.5 years, the Revision Preparation Group has explored options for how church government might be presented in any future revision. We have surveyed friends on how you use the church government sections of Quaker Faith and Practice now. We have consulted with Church Government Advisory Group, and we've run workshops, for example, at yearly meeting gathering. Our settled recommendation, endorsed by Meeting for Sufferings and before you this weekend, is to separate out into different places the core principles of our church government from the supplementary details of our practice. At the top level, that's the book on the table, but also online, would be text that, as now, could be changed only by the yearly meeting in session. This would, as now, combine in one printed volume and online material related to the full depth and breadth of Quaker experience and discipline. Alongside this core text, the detail of our church government practices would in future be contained in supplementary materials. And responsibility for these supplementary materials would be allocated to a suitable level. In some cases, that would be Meeting for Sufferings, sometimes another appropriate committee, sometimes relevant central staff. When changes were required, they could be made more promptly by the responsible body, which would reduce the burden on yearly meeting time, but probably more importantly, mean that accurate and relevant guidance is available for friends across the yearly meeting to use. In some ways, this proposal is a natural evolution of our current arrangements. We already have some excellent handbooks and other forms of guidance which supplement the church government text in Quaker Faith and Practice. The Registering Officer's Handbook, maintained by central staff, is one good example. We are not suggesting that the process of splitting details from principles is straightforward. A future revision committee would need to take an overview of both core and supplementary materials to make judgment about what falls into each category and plan how it all fits together. We don't have detailed answers as to how that would be done, but we're clear that it's the right goal. One question that arose in our parallel session yesterday afternoon was whether we were talking about a revision of the content of church government, of our discipline, or just a rewriting of our existing discipline. I think as Revision Preparation Group, we're clear that the task for any revision committee is the latter. We can't load on to a revision committee, which will already have a very demanding brief, additional major tasks, like considering the nature of membership, to pick one example. However, if in attempting rewriting, a revision committee judges that there are major questions of principle that need to be addressed or clarified, it will need to bring them back to yearly meeting for guidance. And of course, yearly meeting doesn't have to wait for that. If there are important matters we feel as a yearly meeting we want to address, let's address them, revision or not. So a revision process would not in itself be a review of the principles of church government, but nor would it just mean stripping out some detail from the main text and leaving everything else unchanged. We feel that now a bold and creative rewriting is needed. What has struck us, and perhaps you, from close reading of the church government sections of Quaker Faith and Practice, is what's not currently there. Throughout the church government sections, there's a lot of material that says how our meetings should be run, but rather less that explains why that is our Quaker practice. And sometimes, even the basic explanation of what we do is missing. For example, in chapter 17, you can work out that a Quaker funeral is similar in format to an ordinary meeting for worship, but there's no simple statement to that effect. This combination of extensive detail without basic explanation is not easily accessible to newer friends. Another absence is that there's very little church government material that speaks directly to smaller meetings. Current guidance can feel onerous at best and irrelevant at worst, particularly for smaller worshipping groups, and an impediment, not an aid, to establishing a new meeting too. In later editions of our current book, we've gradually brought a little more of the voice of lived experience into the church government chapters through extracts and quotes, and this is a process that could be strengthened in a full revision. Freed up from the need to describe, as we do now, forms A, B, C, D, E, and F for marriage, in the book on the table, the key principles of our church government could be presented in a way that is more accessible, more engaging, and more relevant to more friends. And a final word on format. I've made reference to the physical book and online text, as Quaker Faith and Practice is already published and used as both. As part of our preparation work, we have briefly explored the possibilities for future parts of our faith and practice being presented in other ways, might include visual material, for example, and on other platforms. What is possible in terms of media is changing all the time, so this is not an area in which we feel we should be prescriptive at this stage. Accessibility for all friends, including, for one example, those with limited sight, is another important consideration. In this session, it's not practical for us to discuss, let alone agree, the detail of how all this would work. What is before us, friends, is the principle of the approach. Have we listened and discerned rightly the limitations of our current book and the needs of friends in meetings? In broad terms, is a core text focused on enduring principles with more detailed guidance and supplementary materials the right way forward for the next book of discipline?